Hello, today in our video we're going to be looking at the context of the UK economy, and if we get a question on the UK economy in a 25-mark essay, how do you contextualize your arguments using the key phrase in the context of the UK economy? Not just giving facts, but integrating your arguments so that you can get higher level of both evaluation or analysis. Both KAA and eval, both of these things can be improved through the use of context. The context here I've given you is some key points from recent data for the UK economy. Please read through that carefully. And then once you've done that, I've listed out 7 example questions. And on those example questions, I've given 2 points that you could write about. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video, looking at each of those points. How could you integrate that context into those questions? And how would they affect the arguments that you're given? That might take you 15-20 minutes to go through those. Please do spend some time with that, and we'll talk about it in a second. Right, coming back, we're going to be looking at each of these points. I'm not going to go through every single part of each question. Obviously, that could be 15 minutes for each one, but just the application, how to improve your work. So firstly, evaluate the view that there is a conflict between lower levels of inequality and higher productivity. You could also relate this to growth as well. So some sort of conflict between efficiency and inequality and growth and so on. So we could start off by talking about using a progressive income tax system to lower the levels of inequality in the country. It would be great to then talk about the application of the UK real life economy, the tax bans, so on and so forth, and you have those in your notes already. You could then discuss whether that then has impacts on productivity and incentives, and you could also bring in the benefit system as well in the UK. There's lots and lots of things there to bring in. But really what I'm interested in here is interventionist supply-side policies. How does that result? Does it result in a conflict between lower levels of inequality and higher productivity? Well, we could say in the context of the UK economy, with low trend growth of 1% since 2008, in the context of low investment of 18% of GDP, and you could even bring in other things there as well, weak short-run growth after the pandemic, for example. Therefore, interventionist supply-side policies are particularly important. It will incentivize investment, which hopefully, if you've built it in regions which require it and are weaker, for example in the north, you could lower regional inequality and you could raise productivity. And the potential for raising growth as well is particularly clear given the problems that the UK has at this point. Now, at this point, you're not only applying in the KAA, but you're also applying in the evaluation, because please don't give me an opportunity cost, simple opportunity cost evaluation in this exam. We have clear problems of application here. Look, we've got national debt of over 100% of GDP. We've got $116 billion per year in debt interest, almost the size of the education budget. Therefore, with interest rates of 4.5%, any increase to that national debt is going to be particularly difficult to pay off in future. And therefore, while there may not be a conflict between lower levels of inequality and higher productivity, you could argue that there could be in the future because you're going to have to tax more, and that could bring down productivity in the future. Also remember though, inflation is 10.1%, so the real value of that debt will be falling over time, and that might make it less important. So many arguments there you can bring in just from a supply-side policy perspective. Second one, evaluate policies to reduce a current account deficit. We could talk about expenditure switching and, for example, protectionism or changes to exchange rates, something like that. But again, we could bring in supply-side policies. Supply-side policies in the context of the current UK economy, where we have very high inflation, for example, and we have weak productivity growth, again, falling behind. You can really bring that in. Low relative productivity, 49% less output per worker than the US in 2021. That's going to mean that the UK exports are going to be higher in price and therefore less internationally competitive than the US. And therefore, in the context of having only 18% of investment, of GDP going to investment, infrastructure projects may result in higher levels of investment, resulting in higher inflows to the current account through exports. So again, you're contextualizing it, and then you can go on that same opportunity cost evaluation using the debt interest, using the interest rates, using the inflation there, all of those three things added together, again, doing the same thing. Evaluate the view that preventing climate change is the most important macroeconomic objective. This came up recently, but climate change is very current, so we'll talk about it. Firstly, long-run economic growth and investment. Well, in the context of the current UK economy, we have low investment of 18% of GDP. Therefore, it may be important to work to prevent climate change by raising investment in renewables, raising investment in our electricity grid, and creating a renewable economy. That might be an opportunity to change the current rate of low trend growth and improve the overall competitiveness of the economy. So you can contextualize that argument with the challenges that the UK is currently facing. Now, you could also talk about the short-run economic growth and budget deficit problems that this would create, because you're going to have to pay for it, and businesses will have to have higher costs in order to invest in these things. And so you could put it in the context of the current external shocks that we're seeing, in the current context of high inflation, and that would be particularly challenging. Particularly also the budget deficit, what we've said before, those three facts at the bottom there are also going to make it particularly challenging in the short run to achieve it. So again, you can contextualize that point really well. Number 4, the degree to which the UK government faces conflicts of objectives in its policy making. A very, very open question. And you've just got to pick 2 there. Now, we've already talked about some of them already, but growth and inflation would be great things to talk about. Now, in the current, you can then bring in that low rate of trend growth for the UK, low productivity growth of 1%, or low trend growth of 1% per year, in the greater context, with high inflation of 10.1% and all of those things. You can then say that that's a particularly difficult conflict to manage, and you're going to have to choose one, which is probably going to be lower inflation at the cost of higher growth. You can also bring in things like Brexit and the pandemic hitting consumer confidence, and meaning that right now, growth being very weak, the bottom of this G7 in terms of our coming out of the pandemic, the UK economy is about the same size as it was in 2019, with the US being over 5% larger. And so you can really say in that context, that's a particularly big conflict. Again, we've talked about growth and the budget deficit. If growth is funded through expansionary policies, particularly supply-side policies, then you can say, well, all of these problems about opportunity costs and the national debt, you can bring that back in again and say that that is a particularly big problem unless inflation is reducing the real value of our debt. So again, same things coming round and round again. You could, though, also talk about the possibility of using, and I think this is a really good thing that you need to get to in some of your essays, and that is talking about free policies that don't require money. They are often your market-based policies. For example, deregulation and the possibility, for example, after Brexit, of creating new trade deals, the possibility possibly of lower environmental regulations, lower labour market regulations, for example, and they may then mean that you don't face the same conflicts between those two things, but they would probably conflict with other things like the environment or inequality. 5. Evaluate the effects of supply-side shocks on the UK economy. Well, very similar to 6. These are very similar to questions, but again, you would want to be looking at cost-push inflation, this current inflation of 10.1% because of food and fuel and energy increases in prices across the world, and possibly talking about growth. That's coming from your SRAS shift to the left, or a wage price spiral as well. From your neoclassical AD-SRAS diagram. Again, the effects of those supply-side shocks in the context of low trend growth in the UK, low investment, meaning that right now the UK doesn't have a negative output gap. It is at its full employment level of income. That therefore means that you face greater conflicts among these two objectives. and the supply side shock will mean that growth will have to be sacrificed for inflation objectives, at least in the short term. Inequality. Well, clearly there's a big impact of supply side shocks on inequality, and you can really go into that. I don't think that relates so much to what we have said above here. Evaluate the effects of high inflation, or we've done this as an essay, but again, wage price spirals and putting that into the context of the UK economy, higher interest rates as well would be very useful. And finally, evaluate the causes of relatively low productivity growth in the UK economy. I think my previous video was on the effects of low productivity growth, but what about the causes? Well, the causes there are all of this application data that we have. And we can talk about the low investment relative to other countries. Germany, 24% of GDP going toward investment. China probably into the higher 30%, up to 40%. With the UK down at 18%. And we can bring the Brexit, we can bring the pandemic into all these things. Corporate uncertainty, lack of consumer confidence, possibly even the accelerator could be brought in here as well. Low economic growth leading to low levels of investment. And finally, your low government spending or possibly government failure, NIMBYism, delays to government projects, so on and so forth, therefore creating low productivity growth. And again, putting that into the context of the national debt, of the opportunity costs and the debt repayments that the UK must make, therefore gives you further things to talk about. So I hope that wasn't too quick, but you can see how much we have used there. Now, the inactivity rate we haven't used very much, but again, that could be applied as well. Okay, well, thank you for listening. I hope that was useful, and good luck in your exam in the coming days.